Hi, everyone.
Hello again. We've started chapter 14 in Ray Franz's In Search of Christian Freedom. It is the chapter, A People for His Name. And we left off with Acts 1 and 8, where Ray is asking the question, whose witnesses will Christians be? And this is what the text says. You will be witnesses of me, Christ said, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the most distant parts of the earth. That seems clear, so Ray begins the next part. By what right, then, do men who claim to be footstep followers of God's Son select a name which does not even bear witness to the Christ? How do they justify choosing a name that reaches back some 700 years before his appearance as the Messiah, back to words spoken to the Jewish people under the law covenant?
The major justification resorted to in 1931 and thereafter has been that there is no longer anything distinctive about the name Christian. That name has been used by hundreds of millions of persons throughout the world, divided into hundreds of different denominations and sects. What, however, does the adoption of a different name prove or accomplish? It simply follows the pattern of those same hundreds of denominations. Each of them has done the same thing. They have all adopted a distinctive name, as Roman Catholics, Orthodox Catholics, Maronite Catholics, Lutherans, Methodists, Baptists, Church of Christ, Church of God, Mennonites, Society of Friends, and so forth.
That not all who subsequently took the name Christian truly were such is evident. Christ Jesus warned of apostasy in his parable of the wheat and the weeds. The Apostle Paul, who was known as a Christian, echoed that warning in his writings. In the Revelation, the Apostle John laid bare the impure, adulterated state already existing in some congregations in his day. It was clearly recognized that there would be false Christians, many of them. But neither Christ nor Paul nor John nor any of the Bible writers indicated that a change of name would in any way remedy the situation. It was not by the adoption of some different name, a new label as it were, but by means of a life course that exemplified genuine Christianity, and by means of adherence to the truth as found in the teachings of God's Son and his apostles and disciples, that the only meaningful distinction could be made. When the angels of God carry out the final part of the parabolic picture in effecting the harvest of the wheat from the weeds, labels in the form of denominational names surely will play no part. The only objection I have to Ray's point here is that his use of the word apostasy in this parable of the wheat and the weeds. It would be more like heresy, really, that there would be false teachers and false teachings growing up aside each other. But apostasy is more of a standing away from, a deliberate drawing away from. The next subhead is restoration of the name. By whom?
One might think from reading the Watchtower publications that the name Jehovah was virtually unknown before its appearance in those publications, and that these have brought it to the world's notice. An examination of the Watchtower publications during the first 40 years of their existence, however, reveals that the name Jehovah appeared with no greater frequency in those publications than in many other religious publications of the time. Yeah, we know that's true. We did that test when we were leaving the witnesses with books we had on hand. As just one example, the Watchtower issue of April 15, 1919, contained the name Jehovah only one time in the entire magazine. That would be unthinkable today. Yet by 1919, Christ Jesus is supposed to have already approved and chosen, out of all the religions on the earth, the organization built around the Watchtower Society as his sole channel of communication. If so, one would be obliged to say that his choice evidently was not predicated on any special prominence given to the name Jehovah.
The fact is that religious writers of various Christian faiths had employed the name Jehovah in their writings with considerable frequency for centuries before the appearance of the Watchtower Society. The library of the writing department at the Watchtower headquarters contains a large number of Bible commentaries and other works dating back 2 or more centuries, which clearly illustrates this. The name is to be found in the hymn books of many long-standing Protestant denominations. One of the better-known hymns of the 18th century is titled "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah." We might remember that was the favorite hymn of the pastor in our church, where we worshiped for 20 years.
We sang it very frequently.
The Watchtower magazine itself has published material showing the appearance of the Tetragrammaton in past centuries in many countries of the world in religious buildings and inscriptions. As far back as the year 1602, the Spanish Bible translation by Cipriano de Valera rendered the Tetragrammaton thousands of times as Jehovah. In the 19th century, translations of the Bible made in various languages by Christian missionaries had already utilized some form of the name Jehovah in their rendering of the Tetragrammaton. The trend towards non-use of the name seems to have been to a considerable degree contemporaneous with the development of a particular school of religious thought in the latter part of the 19th century, which propagated a more critical attitude toward the Bible as a whole.
Notably, in the year 1901, the American Standard Version of the Bible, produced by scholars of Christendom, rectified the practice of substituting Lord, all in caps, or God, all in caps, for the Tetragrammaton in translating the Hebrew Scriptures, a practice typical of most previous English versions, including the most popular, the King James, or the Authorized Version. Whereas the Authorized Version rendered the Tetragrammaton by the name Jehovah only 4 times in the entire Hebrew Scriptures, or Old Testament, the American Standard Version restored it in its nearly 7,000 occurrences. Though the inaccuracy of the rendering of the Hebrew YHWH by Jehovah is acknowledged, this was nonetheless an improvement over the use of God, all caps, and Lord, all caps, employed to represent the Tetragrammaton in other English language versions.
Then there's a couple of footnotes to this point, one of which has to do with the use of the American Standard Version, where he says, although the American Standard Version, with its rendering of the name Jehovah thousands of times, was available from 1901 onward, the Watchtower magazine did not adopt that translation as its basic translation, but continued to employ primarily the King James or Authorized Version, with its use of Lord and God as substitutes for the Tetragrammaton. Even after the death of Russell in 1916, and during the presidency of Rutherford, this continued to be the case. Following Rutherford's death in 1944, the Watchtower Society obtained rights for printing an edition of the American Standard Version on their own presses. Yet although frequently quoting from this translation, and numerous others, they continued to use the Authorized Version as their basic version in all their publications up till the year 1950, when they published their own New World Translation of the Bible. And the other note has to do with a brief period that I recall back around the time I was baptized, when suddenly we were being encouraged to call ourselves, even at the door, Jehovah's Christian Witnesses. And as quickly as that seemed to come in, it also disappeared as quickly, I recall. And I don't recall until I read this realizing why that had happened. But apparently there was a legal entity that had called itself Jehovah's Christian Witnesses, made up of ex-witnesses. And so the Watchtower
Just
quietly dropped this tendency.
Yeah. Without explanation.
Yeah.
Just dropped it.
So there's the footnote that deals with that group, among others, at the bottom of page 492.
In addition to the group already mentioned, officially known as Jehovah's Christian Witnesses, There are also a considerable number of earlier sacred name movements, prominent among which is that called Assemblies of Yahweh. None of these show any connection, in origin or otherwise, with the Watchtower organization. These movements use the name derived from the Tetragrammaton with a frequency that is certainly equal to that of Jehovah's Witnesses, and their Bible translations, such as the Holy Name Bible, use that name with even greater frequency in the New Testament scriptures. Further information on this is to be found in the treatise by Rud Pedersen. Persson, sorry. I'm thinking Danish. Pedersen. Persson, mentioned later in this chapter.
So we're going to put on your screen the first batch of videos in a series we called Why JW Org Will Fall and the Church Will Stand. It has to do with this parable that Ray derives some of his ideas from here, the wheat and the weeds, as to the wheat and the weeds growing together, and how the labeling of any group therefore becomes anathema, even if you only had that parable to judge by, because Christ is letting the wheat and the weeds, that is the true and the false Christians, grow side by side. It would be nice, yes, if they could be cleanly labeled false and true. But that's never been the case in Christendom, and it's certainly not the case since Jehovah's Witnesses came along and took their peculiar name as a badge, right? As indeed many other denominations have done before, without necessarily being as judgmental.
And they're built up, but every organization or every denomination is built up of many different people.
Yeah.
So how are you ever going to say truth, false? You can't within a group of people.
We will put that video up, the first of that playlist, Wheat and the Weeds Growing Together, and also videos about Johannes Graber, the occultist who, among other ideas that he has in common with the Watchtower, believes that there is a thing called apostate Christendom. So if this is an idea that Graber got from the occult regions, we have every reason to think that they're
suspect.
Suspect and should be investigated closely. So apostate Christendom, that's one of the subjects in these Graber videos, which we'll put on your screen. And next time, is the use of Yahweh or Jehovah justified, especially in the New Testament?